The Time Trap, Chapter 9. For hours the two struggle through the sticky ooze up the slope of the slowly rising plane. In the thin air their lungs pump painfully. Twice Mason sees something flying overhead, vague in the distance, but he cannot make out its nature. It is apparently winged and is not clearly the time ship. They find the ship at last, almost by chance. Its silvery surface glows like a flame in the grey, dull plain. It seems hours before they reach it, and it is empty. Murdoch and Eric have vanished. There are signs of a struggle and a pool of dried blood on the floor. In the mud outside, a confused track leads towards the east. Frowning, Mason swings shut the door and turns to the controls. "I can move the ship, Eliza. Maybe we can find Eric and Murdoch. That spoor's pretty clear." The girl wraps her cloak more closely to her slender body. "Do so, Kent." She finds a flask of water and offers it to Mason before she drinks. Slowly the craft rises, drifts on above the waist, following the track. On the horizon, a spire rises, growing taller as they advance. It is a cyclopean crag, not the work of nature. It is too regular, Mason realizes, a great cylindrical shaft, thrusting itself from the grey, empty plain into the grey sky, flat-topped, desolate, and colossal. "They may be in that," Mason suggests. "See if you can find some weapons, Eliza." Presently, the girl gives him Murdoch's egg-shaped projector. "It works on the metal men," she tells him. "Whether it will succeed in killing living beings, I do not know." "Well, it's better than nothing. I still have my club." Mason glances down at the metal bar. The surface of the tower is perhaps 2 miles across and quite flat. There is an odd flickering in the air above it, and once or twice Mason catches a fugitive glimpse of bright color and flashes out from the gray desolation of the tower and is gone. In the exact center is a round black opening, and towards this Mason lowers the ship slowly. He lands on the rim, almost losing control of the craft in his surprise, for directly beneath him, springing out of the empty nothingness, looms a great granite boulder. It is 20 feet high, and he is slanting towards it, paralyzed with astonishment and horror. With a grating crash, the ship lands. The shock almost throws him from his feet. The boulder is gone. He follows the direction of Eliza's astonished gaze, turns and sees the boulder behind the ship. Apparently they had passed through it as though it were a phantom. Nor was this all. All around, where he had seen nothing but a flat metallic surface from the air, is a wilderness of tumbled riven rock. To all sides tower the great boulders, and overhead a blazing white sun glares down. "Good Lord," Mason gasps. "We haven't moved in time. What's happened?" "Magic," Eliza says, solving the problem to her own satisfaction. "Do you think Eric and Murdoch are here?" "If they are, they flew in." As Mason speaks, he realizes his guess is not too far-fetched. He has seen creatures flying in the air, perhaps the very beings that have captured the vanished pair. "I hope Eric is not dead," the girl murmurs. "Shall we search, Kent?" Nodding, Mason opens the port and steps out, followed by the girl. He approaches the great rock and tries to touch it. His hand passes through the brown, rugose surface as though it does not exist. "It's a mirage," Mason says suddenly with conviction. "An unbelievably perfect one. 3-dimensional. Artificially created, I'm sure. Look at your feet, Eliza." The girl's slim ankles are hidden, seemingly in gray slate-like rock, but she steps forward without hindrance. Mason moves to her side, feeling the smooth surface of the flat tower top beneath him. He gets down and feels the cold metal with his hands. Then, smiling a little, he plunges his hand and then his head into one of the great phantom boulders and finds himself instantly in profound darkness. He hears Eliza cry out. He moves back, and there is the white sun pouring down its non-existent, heatless rays, and all around is the tumbled wilderness of jagged rock. "Your head," said the girl shakily. "It vanished." "Yeah," Mason nodded. "And I've just thought of something. The hole in the roof. We'd better be careful, or we'll both vanish for good. There may be a stairway going down it, though." Trying to remember the location of the gap, he steps forward cautiously, gripping the girl's hand. They wade through intangible rocks and sometimes come up to their waist. It is fantastic, incredible science of an alien world. And suddenly Mason feels a mighty throbbing that grows and pulses all about him. The wilderness of barren rock trembles and shivers like a painted curtain rustling in the wind, and abruptly it changes. Like a motion picture fading from one scene to another, the panorama of rocks that seemed to stretch to the horizon grows vague and disappears, and in its place grows another scene, a weird alien landscape that hems in the pair as though they have been transported to another world. All about them now is a tangled forest of luxuriant vegetation, and the bark of the trees, as well as the leaves, the thick masses of vines, and even the grass underfoot, is an angry, brilliant crimson. Nor is that the worst. The things are alive. The vines writhe and swing on the trees, and the trees themselves sway restlessly, their branches twitching in the air. No wind stirs them. They are living beings, and even the long, curiously serpentine red grass at their feet makes nauseating little worm motions. There is no sun, just an empty blue sky, incongruously beautiful and peaceful amid the writhing horrors that hem them in. The forest that is as immaterial as a phantom as the phantom rocks have been. Wait a minute, Mason says. He takes a few steps back, for a curious theory is forming in his mind. And again comes the mighty throbbing and the strange crawling and shifting of the red forest, and as he retreats it melts swiftly into the familiar wilderness of jagged rock. Alesa has vanished. Looking over his shoulder, Mason can see the time ship beside the great boulder. He moves forward again, and Alesa springs into view, her golden eyes wide and frightened. Okay, he tells her, let's hunt for the hole, eh? Here it is, Kent. I almost fell into it. She points at the wormy tangle of red grass nearby. Mason stares. Of course, he cannot see down into the gap. The scarlet vegetation hid it. He kneels and, overcoming his repugnance, thrusts his face down through the twisting grasses. He is in an empty blackness below the ground level in the world of the red plants, Mason knows. A curious conviction comes to the man that these senses, these strange scenes, are not merely created phantoms, but actual reflections of real worlds that exist, or did exist, or will exist in the future. He circles cautiously about the gap. It is about 20 feet across. His fumbling hands find an incline going down into the darkness, slippery and too steep to walk upon. It goes down at an angle of about 45 degrees, as well as Mason can judge, crawling on his hands and knees and feeling there in the empty darkness. Kent, the girl says with quiet urgency, listen. What? Then he hears it, a harsh, very loud scratching noise. It comes from the depths of the invisible shaft. It grows louder, and a sudden premonition makes Mason seize Aleza's hand and retreat swiftly. It is lucky that they have. The thing comes out of the shaft, and first they see a bristle of waving antennae and two huge claws jerking convulsively in empty air. It comes rising inexorably out of the ground, and in a moment they see the whole frightful being. An ant, Mason hears himself whispering. A winged ant. But it is a colossus, 25 feet long. It towers, mandibles clashing, wings outspread, rustling dryly as they clash against the wing cases, crawling up blindly. The creature moves forward. It is blind, Mason guesses. No eyes are visible, but the antennae apparently take their place. The claws click menacingly. Horror turns Mason cold. As the thing advances, he flings himself back, pulling Alesa with him. The ship, he says unsteadily. Come on. The white-faced girl nods, keeping pace with him. At a venture, Mason races in the direction he thinks the ship lay. His guess is wrong. Almost immediately he hears the throbbing and sees the wavering and shifting, and then they are rushing through nothingness. Empty fog, great billows of thick stuff that are so turbid he is completely blinded. Thinking with lightning speed, Mason turns at right angles, dragging Alesa, and cuts across in a frantic attempt to locate the ship. He hears a clashing, dry rustling, the giant ant hurrying in pursuit. Madness of fear tugs at Mason's brain. It is the quintessence of horror, wading through rocks that he cannot feel, racing through trees that do not exist. The ant trails its prey by scent, or by some less familiar sense, and as it is blind, the shifting three-dimensional mirages make no difference to it. They have been created, apparently, to confuse the enemies of the ant monsters. Mason and Alesa will be sprinting through what seems to be a field of emeralds, glinting under a hazy sky with a low-hanging moon. when there would come the shifting and throbbing, and the panorama would fade away like the mirage it was, and in its place will come perhaps a vast field of frozen white, with not an object visible, and a black starless sky overhead. Once they are hurrying through a green swirl of water, with seaweed drifting by and curious creatures swimming past them, through them, a thing like a great opaque white ball, pulsing and writhing, drifting at Mason, and he leaps aside, shuddering. Then they will hear the dry rustling, and it will be bolt, sprint, and race, with temples throbbing and sweat running into their eyes, till the two would be forced to fling themselves down and rest while they gasp for breath. They are zigzagging and plunging through a weird and fantastic array of alien worlds and scenes. Mason cannot help flinching when the great tree or wall of ice would loom in his path, though he knows the thing is an impalpable phantom. Then, too, there is the ever-present fear that they will plunge off the edge of the tower. What saves them is nearly their doom, for as they are racing through a curiously regular rank of thin columns, like bamboo, that stretch up to the far whiteness that is either the sky or an incredibly lofty roof, they burst suddenly into the world of living vegetation. Mason goes rushing through a swaying red tree. A rasping sound of pursuit is loud in his ears, and his feet go out from under him. Letting go of Eliza's hand, he falls heavily on his side, sliding down till his hips are on the polished slide that leads down into the interior of the tower and the lair of the ant monster. He keeps on sliding. Desperately, Mason gives a frantic twist and squirm that nearly breaks his back. He feels Eliza's hands pulling him to safety. The girl's white body gleams through the flaring cloak. Somehow, Mason scrambles to his feet, his breath a flaming agony within his lungs. The monster is nearly upon them. Remembering Murdoch's weapon, Mason claws out, aiming it. A thin beam springs at the giant ant. Light crawls weirdly over the frightful head, and the thing dies. Without a sound, it drops through its impetus, carrying it forward till it slides over the brink of the abyss and vanishes from sight. No sound comes from below. Trembling a little, Mason replaces the weapon. "Come on, Eliza," he says shakily. "We've got to find the ship. There may be more of these devils around." But it is not easy to locate the vessel. The two play a weird game of blind man's bluff there on the top of the tower, hurrying through mirages. Some they recognize, others totally unfamiliar. Some are horrible, and others pleasant enough. The worst is hurrying over a black gelatinous substance that heaves restlessly underfoot like the hide of some cyclopean monster. It may have been, for all he knew, Mason thinks. The black heaving skin seems to stretch for miles around, and sometimes the two are buried to their hips in it. Again they hurry across a field of hard frozen brown earth, with a phenomenally beautiful night sky overhead, studded with constellations and gleaming planets entirely unfamiliar. A great comet glows in its white glory among the stars. Then there is the surface of ice or glass, and looking down, Mason can see far below vague and indistinct figures that seem entirely inhuman, as far as he can make out through the cloudy crystalline substance. They stagger through a world of blazing fire, flinching as heatless tongues of flame lick at them. They reel across a vast desert of sand that crawls and billows beneath them, stirring with a monstrous embryonic life. But at last they find the ship. With heartfelt relief, Mason follows Eliza aboard and closes the door, sending the vessel lancing upwards. The girl sinks down in a limp heap, her breasts heaving tumultuously. At a safe distance above the tower, Mason stops the ship, hovering there while he ponders. Are Eric and Murdoch captive within the huge eidolon? Or... A cry from Eliza makes him turn. She is pointing. "Look, it's Eric," Mason finishes excitedly. "And Murdoch." Crawling across the grey plain, almost at the foot of the tower now, is one of the giant ants, carrying in its claws two limp figures that are, even at a distance, unmistakably human. His hand closes on his weapon in his pocket. Mason sends the ship flashing down. But, the thought comes, can he use the ray projector on the monster without killing his friends? No, he can't risk it. The huge ant seems to sense danger. It pauses, antenna questing, as the ship drops towards it. Then, dropping its burdens, it spreads its wings and mounts to do battle. End of chapter 9.